In the last video, we noted that all this communication is in part directed down here, that it is made for everyone, every man. And then he says, for kings and those who are in authority, so that we might lead a tranquil and quiet life in godliness and dignity. The word tranquil is a word meaning calm. The words, as he's talking about a quiet life here, is talking about that doesn't mean that there's silence, that we're not saying anything, but we're not saying it in a boisterous, loud, protesting type manner. And the importance of this is because rather than, and this is the way many people think, that we need to fix the government, we need to be at the government, and I become personally kind of alarmed with believers, people I know who are believers even sometimes, for certain, that spend a lot of time just raging against the system. And that's absolutely the opposite of these two words. And yet they're on social media and they speak out and you're talking with them and they don't do either one of these. And yet this is exactly why Paul says we should be talking to God. And it's not that you talk to God and then God makes everything go right so that, guess what? Now my life's easy because now the government is my kind of government. That's not what this is about. It's that you're taking it to God and you realize God takes care of it and He's in control and He can deal with these things. And if we understand that, and if we appreciate that, we can live this kind of a life in godliness, a life that honors God. God is honored not by our yelling at the world, yelling at the government, but by our demonstrating Christ-likeness. Remember when Christ went to the cross? What did He do when He went to the cross? He said 7 things. And none of those things were hostile. None of those things were vindictive. None of those things were, just wait, I'll be back. That is not what He did when He went to the cross. In fact, the book of Isaiah said, like a ewe that is silent before her shearers. He said this was the nature of Christ. And that's the kind of godliness that you and I can exemplify. We're going to talk about the word thanksgiving up here, connected with this here today, because I want to point out a couple things in this regard that I think sometimes as believers we do not think about. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and I want to start over in Romans chapter 13. Romans 13 and verse 1, where Paul says, let everyone submit to the governing authorities. Same kind of language we have over there in 1 Timothy 2. Since there is no authority except from God. Notice that. There is no authority. Now, I think one of the things that's important to understand is when Paul's writing this, the Roman Empire is being governed by a man by the name of Nero, a very violent and very vile ruler. Now, many of the rulers were like. It's not like he was the exception. He just kind of did some things, well, maybe even a little bit more excessive, especially eventually regarding believers. But he's reminding them there's no authority except from God. The king that took Israel or took Judah captive in the Old Testament was Nebuchadnezzar, an arrogant man that I'm responsible for all this. I've done all these things. God took that man and humbled him, and I'm convinced caused him to become an Old Testament believer by the act of humiliating him, let him run wild as a beast in the field for 7 years. But that government back there in the Old Testament, in the same way, was initiated by God, and that was part of the prophecy that Daniel was giving for the sake of those people. And so he says there's no authority except from God, and the authorities, they exist, are instituted by God. So then, one who resists the authority then, he's opposing God's command. Christians look at this and they go, yeah, but what we're opposing is the unrighteous things they're doing. Nero wasn't unrighteous. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't unrighteous. It said, is God's purpose always just that these people are supposed to be exemplary of righteousness? Most of the rulers of the world, probably 99% of the rulers of the world, and maybe 99.9% of the rulers of the world, have been unsaved, unrighteous individuals. and yet they've all been there as part of God's plan. It's a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around, but part of the purpose is God's plan is not to accomplish his purpose through human government being good and righteous. I know probably there's going to be some people throw comments down below because this gets people riled up, but I think it's a real challenge for us to think about that. But hold on. He says, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. And it could be God's judgment, but it's God's judgment through the government that's in place. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct. In other words, normally if you just do what's right, well, you're not normally going to suffer horribly. Now, that wasn't true in the first century when Paul writes this. Guess what? There were a lot of Christians that were going to suffer at the hands of the Roman government, and even Paul himself would eventually be imprisoned and beheaded by the Roman government. He says, do you want to be unafraid of one authority? Do what is good. You'll have its approval. For it is God's servant for good, and if you do what is wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword. Think of whatever implement they use to enforce government today. Does not carry the sword for no reason. In other words, the purpose of the sword was to make people abide, to make people obey. Let's take a look at an example of this. Acts chapter 21. Paul goes to Jerusalem. Whatever your reasoning or whatever way you might think about what Paul did down here, Paul ends up in the temple. He ends up putting up money for four Christian men to finish their vows with the proper sacrifices at the temple. And while he's up there, they see Paul. They think that he's taken a Gentile in, which Paul has not done. They grab Paul. They shut the doors of the temple. And verse 31, and as they were trying to kill him, word went up to the commander of the regiment that all Jerusalem was in chaos. Taking along soldiers, the centurions, he immediately ran down to them, seeing the commander and the soldiers, and they stopped beating Paul. Paul's being beaten. When we read Paul's statement in Timothy, Paul actually experienced a benefit of a Roman government official keeping Paul from being beaten to death by these Jews up there in Jerusalem. Verse 33, then the commander approached, took him into custody, ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd were shouting one thing and some another, and since he was not able to get a reliable information because of their uproar, he ordered him to be taken into the barracks. And when Paul got to the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. Here Paul is being protected by Roman soldiers from a violent crowd that wants to do nothing but kill him and do him harm. For the mass of people followed, yelling, "Get rid of him." And as he was about to be brought into the barracks, Paul said to the commander, "Am I allowed to say something to you?" And he replied, "You know how to speak Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt some time ago, led 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" Paul says, "I am a Jewish man from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of an important city, and now I'm asking you, let me speak to the people." And he's going to give him permission to speak to the people, and the people are going to listen for a while Paul gets to this, until eventually he gets down to God's commission for him for what Paul's supposed to be doing, and then they turn violent, and this military commander has to make sure Paul is taken away so that he isn't killed, and they have to stop the violence. Now, I think this is very interesting because there's a lot of other things we take out of this, but one of the things we can take away is that God protected Paul's life because God had something for Paul. And so God allows, think about that. This violence happened. What's the chance that Paul could have maybe been beaten to death before they got there? But God timed it so that Paul was not beaten to death, so that they were able to rescue Paul and get him out and protect him, because he still had a purpose. God still had a purpose for Paul. This is part of one of the things that I think as believers we can thank God for those in authority. Because generally, they do look out to protect us. Most nights, at night when I go to bed and I put my head on the pillow, I don't sleep with one ear on the pillow and one ear open listening. Are people breaking into my house? Are there roving hordes coming? Are they going to break in and steal everything I have? I don't really think that way. You know why? Because our community has a police force, and the police force patrols our town. They keep watch on the things that go on in our community, and because of them, usually we don't have a lot of violent crime of this nature. Now, I'm not saying violent crime doesn't exist, because obviously law enforcement can't be everywhere at once. But I'm just trying to say, most of us don't live our lives in fear of, as one of my friends used to say, roving hordes coming over the hill to pillage. We don't worry about that. Now, there are people in some parts of the world that their government doesn't really protect them, doesn't really cause this to happen, but I think probably most of us live in a place where that is not the case. I hope that that's the case for you. I realize it may not be. But I believe that that's one of the reasons that we can give thanks for those people who are in authority, that govern us and maintain some order. Is it always the order I would like to see? Not necessarily. But generally, it's order that keeps me safe, and I think probably keeps you safe where you are. Yeah, you can give thanks for government. I think more Christians maybe need to think more positively about what God does. I'm not trying to give government officials and such a pass on some of the criminality and things they do and whatever might happen wherever you might live. But that aside, and that's been true all through the history of the world, corruption has been rampant through government through the history of the world. And you say, well, am I thanking God for corruption? No, but you're thanking God for when government actually does some of the things that government is supposed to do, such as keeping the peace and protecting the citizenry where it is. And that's one of the things we benefit from. And for one of the things we should, and Paul says it, we should be giving thanks to God. And there's one reason, because some of you might think, I can think of no good reason. Well, I just showed you one. And I'm sure the Apostle Paul could think of this and this experience and realize, man, I could have been beaten to death. I could have been killed. But God used human government to protect my life. It's obviously giving credit to God, but in the end, God's the one that put those in control that were. He put this military commander in control, and the soldiers that were there. He put them there. It wasn't just that he put Nero there, but he also put all these other individuals there at this time. So, without belaboring the point, think about what you can do when you're able to say, God, thank you. Thank you for the food. Thank you for the fact that I get to sleep in a place where I'm protected from the elements outside and I'm not freezing at night. And thank you even for those people that govern us, that in doing so, they keep some order. And it allows us to live in some form of peace, we trust. Thank God for these kinds of things. Thank God for what He's doing, for His good grace to us, even through social, civil government. So with those things, remember who you are in Christ. Talk to God. Talk to God. Don't yell at the world. Talk to God. That's what this is about. And even give thanks. And as always, I want to thank you for joining me.